Okay, hey, we're going to finish up World War One here as quickly as we can. And so the last video we talked about on December 1914, December 25th, 1914, we have the Christmas truce, which is an unannounced cease to the fighting in which troops on both sides come out, bury dead people in no man's land. They play soccer, they exchange gifts, and it's just this victory for humanity in which the love of your common man outweighs your hatred of war. And so or hatred during war, and so that's a change. We talked briefly in the last video about the blockades that are going to take place, and so the Germans are going to use submarines to blockade England. They sink thousands. I think they sink up to a third of the British fleet during World War One, which is pretty significant. They also sink some passenger ships. And so when World War One breaks out, the United States is trying to stay neutral during this time frame. And so the German sinking of boats and the killing of civilians through submarine warfare is really going to place a strain on the American and German relations and the neutrality of Germany during this war. Ultimately, the British blockade is going to be better than the German blockade, and the economic ties of America trading with the British and able to sustain trade with the British throughout the war is what's going to connect the Americans to the Allied side a little bit stronger than the British or than the Germans. Probably the most famous boat that's going to get sank during the war is the Lusitania. The Lusitania is actually a British ship. Sometimes it'll be referred to as incorrectly as a neutral ship or as a American ship. Our slide is a little bit confusing there, but the Lusitania is a British ship. I think 2,000 people die with the sinking of the Lusitania. 16 or 160 are Americans. The interesting part of this is that the Germans take out ads in newspapers, basically reminding the Americans that, hey, there's a war going on in Europe, and boats coming into England or into Europe in general are not safe. And yet Americans constantly get on steamliners going back and forth over the ocean and get sank by German vessels, right? And so for a time being, and 1915s, the Germans are going to back off a little bit of submarine warfare to ensure that the American government and the American people don't get upset and enter the war on the side of the British. We look at April 1915, the Germans in the Second Battle of Ypres, they used poison gas trying to break the stalemate of trench warfare. A number of different chemicals are developed during this time frame in the war. There's mustard gas, there's chlorine gas. Basically, they're all used to scar up tissue and to in the lungs and to do damage to the opposing army's eyes. But really what it's doing is the gas is heavier than the oxygen, and so it's going to land, it's going to fill in those trenches and trying to get the guys out of the army guys out of the trenches so they can be shot by the opposite side. The Allied offensives are also, the Allies are going to turn around and use poison gas as well. And so, I mean, there's definitely plenty of blame to go back and forth on the use of chemical weapons in the First World War. But the Germans will use it first, and that's why they will receive a lot of criticism. The two main battles that are going to take place in the middle part of this war on the Western Front are going to happen in Verdun and in the Battle of the Somme. Verdun is right in the middle of the western lines. It's on that French-German border, and the Germans basically come up with an idea that they're just going to flood this zone in Verdun with as many troops as they possibly can, and they're going to try to kill as many Frenchmen as humanly possible. They set up kill zones, and they try to trap the French in this this meat grinder of a battle in which the Germans believe that they have a stronger stomach for the horrors of war than the French. And the Battle of Verdun ends in a tie. All that really happens is close to 1 million people are going to be casualties of war during this. At the same time, so that's going to happen in February, and it's going to last really throughout the first half, maybe a little bit longer of 1916. There's a number of what historians will refer to as the Battle of Verdun. It's not like battles of Verdun. It's not just a couple days. It is a huge long-term offensive. And trying to relieve some of the pressure off of the French lines. The British are going to launch what they're going to refer to as their big push in the Battle of the Somme in July of 1916. And they use artillery for 7 days straight. You can see one of the pictures there is just spent artillery shells. They use over 1 million shells of artillery against the German lines before they send in their troops. But the problem is for the Allies bombing the Germans had fortified their trenches and were well protected from artillery at that point of the war. This offensive is unsuccessful in anything other than just killing a large number of people. Again, over 1 million people are going to die in this battle, or close to 1 million people are going to die in this battle. And the lines are going to move less than 1/4 of a mile. And so in 1917, a couple interesting things happened. Number one, Woodrow Wilson proposes this idea that at the end of 1916, that the Allies and the Central Powers just call it a tie. Like, hey, let's just go back to the way things were, and we'll just be done with this. It's just senseless while we're killing all these people. And the Allies and the Central Powers do not like that idea. They want a clear winner, which is I don't know, which is kind of ironic if you follow Western sports, because Americans typically don't like sports that end in ties, and Europeans love soccer, and soccer oftentimes will end in the tie. So in 1917, the Germans actually withdraw their troops eastward. So the Germans are going to withdraw their troops eastward about 50 miles off of the front. And what they're trying to do here is they're trying to establish a new line of war. And one of the things they're trying to do is they're trying to get the Allies out of the trenches, out into the open, where they can be, or hopefully they can be shot and weakened. The Germans are going to construct concrete bunkers, much stronger defensive fortifications in this Hindenburg line. And I think I have a map here that kind of shows you this red dotted line here was the original line of battle. And the Germans are going to fall back about 50 miles to this fortified line. You can see the British here tracing the Germans back. You can also see just the destruction of war in this picture on the left. There's not a tree left. It's just all artillery and just destruction laid in the wake. In 1917, early 1917, the Russians are not the go through everybody. It's like my kids. When I yell at my kids, I run through all of their names. The Germans are trying to end this war. They just went through the winter of 1916 was referred to as the winter of the tulip, or the winter of the turnip, not the tulip, the winter of the turnip in Germany, in which there's just no food to eat. And so the common people are starving. All the resources are going to the war effort, and the war effort is just crippling Germany. And so Germany is going to try to end this war early on in 1917. The war in the East, the Germans have basically, for all intents and purposes, defeated the Russians. The Russians will continue that war until November of 1917, but early on in 1917, the war is going as badly as it can for the Russians, and the Germans are afforded the luxury of taking troops off of the Eastern Front and sending them to the Western Front. And they feel like if they can take more troops and put them in the Western Front, and they can increase submarine warfare, if they can strengthen their blockade on the British and on the French ports, that they can weaken the Allies to a point that they're going to be victorious. But by 1917, the Americans have formed a pretty close economic relationship with with the Allies, and Germany realizes that they're probably not going to allow the Allies to lose the war without getting involved in some way. And so Germany gambles, and they send a coded message to their ambassador in Mexico, and this is referred to as the Zimmerman note. It's intercepted by the British. And when it's decoded, Germany basically just proposes an alliance with Mexico, that if Mexico will declare war on the United States, that Germany will pay for it. And when they are successful, when the Germans are successful in winning the war in Europe, they will help the Mexicans in the war in North America, and they will restore, I believe, Arizona and New Mexico and Nevada, possibly even Texas, back to the Mexican government. And they also encourage Mexico to reach out to Japan to join the Central Powers as well. And they're going to offer the Japanese land holdings in Asia. Obviously, this telegram, the Zimmerman note, the Zimmerman telegram, angers the American politicians. It angers Woodrow Wilson. You're going to read in your assignments about the decision to actually enter the war. And in April of 1917, America declares war on Germany and Austria-Hungary. And this is going to be based almost solely on this idea of unrestricted submarine warfare and the Zimmerman note against the United States. And so the United States is going to enter the war, and this flood of American technology, not necessarily American technology, but American industry and a fresh access to American troops are going to swing the advantage of the First World War towards the Allies. Before this, it had hit a stalemate. The Germans get a huge boost in the arm when the Eastern Front comes, for all intents and purposes, comes to an end. They're able to take troops off of the Eastern Front and send them to the Western Front. Something else that should be noted: in March of 1917, I don't have a slide for this, there's a democratic revolution in Russia that overthrows the Tsarist government, or the Tsar at least steps down. And the monarchy of Russia is replaced by a democratic government. It's called the Duma government. And this really opens up the ability of America to enter the war. Woodrow Wilson is president of the United States in 1917, and he is a political scholar, and he is a huge fan of democracy, to the point that he almost stays out of World War I because of Russia being a monarchy, a monarch of some point. And so when the monarchy of Russia, the Tsar of Russia, is replaced by a democratic government, this becomes a war not necessarily of nations in Europe, but it becomes a war of ideas for Wilson. And the fact that France and England and now Russia are all democratic governments, and Germany and Austria-Hungary are both monarchies. And so now he sees America joining the war on the side of democracy, looking to spread democracy, or at least save democracy in the world, and it allows him to justify entry into the war. By June, we had the Third Battle of the Ypres, where the British are trying to capture the German ports on the English Channel. But ultimately, it doesn't work. The interesting thing about the Third Battle of the Ypres, Britain uses a group of miners to plant kind of like an underground tunnel, and they put bombs underneath the German defensive positions. And they blow big holes up, and they kill a whole bunch of people that way. But it's kind of interesting that the extent that the Allies will go to try to break through. Both sides lose again. It combined 1 million troops, and it's really for naught. By the summer of 1917, American troops are starting to come into Europe. The first American troops are starting to see combat. It's going to free up the British in different sections of the front. In November of 1917, the British are going to attack the Hindenburg Line, and they use tanks. And this is the first successful use of tanks. However, The British aren't able to break through the line at this time. In November of 1917, you're going to have a second revolution in Russia. This time, a communist government led by Vladimir Lenin is going to establish a government and take over Russia. And they are going to sign an individual peace deal with the Germans. And so Russia is going to exit World War I. At the same time, they're going to execute the Tsar and his family, Tsar Nicholas, and Russia will leave the war, and that frees up the Germans to take all of their war resources, and the Austrians to take all their war resources in the east and push them into the west. Now, the Allies have basically the majority of their resources on that Western front, but at the same time, there are wars going on, like the British and the Ottomans are fighting in modern day Turkey. You're going to have here, if you read about World War I, you'd read about the Battle of Gallipoli. There's battles in India, there's battles in Africa between different factions. But the Allies, France and Britain, the majority of their focus is always going to be on that Western front. And now, after November of 1917, the Germans are going to be able to put all their resources onto that front, and it's going to be very advantageous for the Germans. They're going to push the Allies all the way on back to the outskirts of Paris. Once again, I think within like 30 miles of Paris, and it's not until the American troops show up in Europe in force by the early part of 1918 that the Allies are able to stop that German advance, and then ultimately launch a counteroffensive as well. In July of 1918, the British are able to break through the Hindenburg Line. The American forces start to launch multiple offensives. The Germans, which had launched a last-ditch kind of counter, or a last-ditch offensive when they get all their resources to the Western line, are overextended and just really unable to match the new level of fighting that the American troops provide for the Allies. Not that the American troops are better fighters or better equipped to fight. It's just the fact that they're new and they're not worn down by multiple years of this slow-moving, bloody stalemate of the Western Front. And so eventually, by July of 1918, more and more Germans are starting to surrender. Woodrow Wilson has proposed this idea of 14 points of peace. He calls this peace deal of 14 points, in which basically offers pretty generous surrender terms to the Germans. And by November 11th, 1918, the war is really over for Germany, and they sue for peace. Kaiser Wilhelm had vacated the throne of Germany. There's a socialist government that takes over in Germany, and they sue the Allies for peace. And this is going to cause some problems on the back end of the war, and the fact that a lot of Germans aren't going to recognize this socialist government that's going to eventually be replaced by a more democratic government as the ruling party of Germany. And the peace terms are going to change pretty drastically from when they were originally offered as Wilson's 14 points to what is actually signed at the Treaty of Versailles, or the Treaty of Paris in 1919. The other thing that's going to probably lead to World War II more than anything else that we just kind of chatted about is the fact that Germany's going to quit the war a little bit early. They don't quit necessarily prematurely because they're defeated, but the Allies never put German or Allied troops deep into the heart of Germany, and so there's the German people in Berlin or Munich or wherever, they don't see French troops, they don't see British troops. And so when we get into the Second World War, and there's this myth about how the Germans never lost, the Germans have something to buy into because they've never conquered. They were never conquered during World War I. And so there's never this clear understanding of defeat. However, World War I does come to an end on November 11th, 1918. It's the most costly war in human history to that point. You're going to see almost 40 million casualties, somewhere between 16 and 20 million dead, 21 million wounded. We look at a casualty as someone that's either dead or wounded to the point that they can no longer continue to fight. And while all that is, in addition, like if not all that is bad enough, you're also going to have the outbreak of the Spanish flu at the tail end of this war, 1918, 1919, in which somewhere between 20 to 40 million people are going to catch the Spanish flu and die as well. And so, you're going to have a global pandemic that's going to break out. And it's the late 1910s are as bad as it can get for humanity. So anyways, that's going to end our discussion on World War One. Again, it's a very big overview of a very complex event. Hope you learned a couple new things. And we'll see you later when we come back and talk about the rise of the dictators and the beginning of World War II in the next chapter. All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.